Madam Chair, I call up Cruz 1. One of the top priorities of Texans and many Americans is ensuring that America is energy independent and energy dominant. And we cannot do that when we have regulations from this administration that discriminate against American energy, even when it has a risk profile similar to that of other commodities. In Texas, we proudly produce the most oil and natural gas in the country, followed by states like Pennsylvania and West Virginia. I cannot overstate how important it is to Texas to keep this country and the world moving. That energy, however, does not magically move around the country. It has to be transported, and there are only a limited number of choices. It can be transported by pipeline, vessel, by rail, or truck. We move many hazardous commodities by rail, including liquefied petroleum gas, liquefied hydrogen, liquefied ethylene, but not liquefied natural gas. And not anytime soon, because the Biden administration believes LNG consumption undermines their Green New Deal climate alarmist agenda. That's why in 2021, the Biden administration suspended a rulemaking that would have allowed railroads to transport LNG, subject to certain safety requirements. This is a huge problem for transporting energy because investing in the tank cars and facilities for moving LNG by rail is expensive and time-consuming. Additionally, LNG providers have to enter into long-term contracts with buyers to ensure that it's profitable to make the investments to transport LNG. By creating regulatory uncertainty, this administration has effectively pocket vetoed the movement of LNG by rail. This is despite the fact that there are fewer hazmat incidents by rail than there are by truck, by a large degree. In fact, the Federal Railroad Administration's website currently says, quote, "Rail transportation of hazardous materials in the United States is recognized to be the safest land-based method of moving large quantities of chemicals over long distances." That's not to say we shouldn't move commodities by truck as well. But if safety and prosperity are our goals, we must recognize that Americans will be both safer and more prosperous after enabling the transportation of all energy commodities, including LNG. Just to provide one example of where it could be useful. Massachusetts currently imports natural gas through the Everett terminal in Boston from countries like Algeria and Trinidad. That LNG is then shipped by truck across the state. My amendment would say that American LNG, rather than foreign LNG moving on our highways, could be shipped safely in new tank cars that meet strict safety standards. And this amendment is designed to improve safety in three ways. First, it would update the tank car requirements for all cryogenic liquids, including LNG, satisfying a safety recommendation made by the Transportation Research Board. Second, it would require between 5 and 8 buffer cars between the locomotive and a cryogenic tank car carrying LNG, providing space between the crew and the first tank car. Third, it would shift some of our LNG off our highways where it currently travels, particularly in blue states that prevent the construction of pipelines. This amendment would also provide regulatory certainty for the movement of all Class 2.1 cryogenic liquids by imposing a non-discrimination requirement. Whatever the rules are for moving other flammable gases by rail, the same rule should apply to the movement of liquefied ethylene, liquefied hydrogen, and LNG. With our allies right now starved for energy and our adversaries capitalizing on it, it's past time to set aside the alarmist rhetoric of the radical left. We all know that the major reason CO2 emissions have declined precipitously in the United States is because of increased natural gas production. If you care about the environment, increased natural gas production shifting away from coal is enormously beneficial to the environment. We should allow American energy products to move in the same terms as all similar commodities that are essential to modern life. And I would note this is not a partisan amendment. In fact, I'm pleased to have worked on it with one of the major railroad unions, Smart Transportation Division. The people whose lives depend on the safe movement of freight by rail clearly see the benefit of safely transporting LNG on their trains. We should listen to them. We have to transport products that can be dangerous but necessary for life. For example, chlorine is typically shipped by rail for cleaning our drinking water. We can have a fair debate about the proper rules for moving hazardous gases, but we should not draw arbitrary distinctions between American energy products and other commodities. And let me note, the proponents of this bill suggest that it has nothing to do with energy. But I would note that this administration, and in particular Secretary Buttigieg's agency, is staffed with radicals who hate American energy production. This bill directs those radicals to engage in rulemakings. If they engage in rulemakings, here's what we can anticipate. We can anticipate rulemakings designed to dramatically drive up the cost of transporting American energy in the United States. That is their political agenda. The consequence for consumers, if that were to happen, would be paying much more at the gas pump every week when you fill up your truck or your car, would be paying much more to heat your home, would be paying much more to live ordinary lives. Given the ravages of inflation, empowering radicals to attack American energy production and perversely make us more dependent on foreign energy is counterproductive. Now, I offered to the proponents of this bill to include this amendment in the bill, which I think would dramatically enhance the chances of passage of the bill, both in terms of getting 60 votes on the floor of the Senate, but also significantly in terms of being likely to pass the House of Representatives. But unfortunately, at least to date, the proponents have declined this offer. Given that, I cannot support the bill, but at the time I'm going to offer, and now I'm going to withdraw the amendment and not call for a vote right now on this amendment. But I will say this: if the proponents want this bill to pass, I am more than ready to work with them. The proponents claim this is not about discriminating against American energy, where there's an easy way to do that, which is to make clear it's not going to empower the administration to discriminate against American energy. Now, I have a second amendment as well. Do you want me to do that?
Yes, thank you.
All right, I'd now like to call up Cruz 7. Cruz 7 would delegate, or rather, this bill would delegate expansive rulemaking authority to Secretary Buttigieg. And I believe it is critical that the safety benefits of each new rule or regulation exceed the costs. My amendment would bring needed certainty to the process of analyzing and justifying impacts of regulation taken in the name of railroad safety. The present bill relies on an executive order alone as the basis for regulatory analysis related to rulemakings. That, unfortunately, is not a sufficient check on the federal government, particularly with this administration. Since President Biden's first day in office, this administration has sought to repurpose the regulatory review process to advance left-wing partisan priorities such as, quote, environmental justice and, quote, unquote, equity. To that end, the Office of Management and Budget is currently revising its circular on regulatory analysis. The proposed revisions would emphasize the, quote, social cost of carbon, include even alleged foreign benefits of domestic rules with real cost on Americans, and deliberately overestimate the long-term benefits of rules to more easily overcome the short-term cost of implementation. Without a check in this bill itself, the administration will be able to distort facts and figures to advance their partisan priorities and interests. I think it's essential to consider the quantifiable benefits, especially with a focus on safety, for every new rule arising from the bill. But if the costs exceed the benefits, then a rule is more harmful than it is beneficial. These principles are fundamental. When government requires railroad to adhere to new rules, they should be cost-effective in advancing safety. My amendment would ensure that the Secretary of Transportation only issues rules, requirements, and regulations under this act after determining that the safety benefits of such actions exceed their costs that are borne by American consumers. And I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment.
Opposing the Cruz amendment, I dispute the idea that the regulation in this bill is burdensome. I'm not alone. Many organizations representing customers of railroads have issued statements in support of this legislation. These customers are sophisticated businesses and know what may occur as the result of this bill. However, preventing derailments and keeping their products safe is also very important to them. The major rulemakings under this bill are subject to the cost-benefit analysis contained in Executive Order 12866, which was issued by President Clinton in 1993 and used by both Democrat and Republican administrations. However, this amendment would create an entirely new cost-benefit analysis framework, but would jeopardize the core of this bill, which is safety. And we have plenty of examples, such as the aviation industry, when we know when these kinds of safety agencies aren't involved with the business impacts. We need safety to be a top priority, as my colleague from Ohio said. With safety being the core of this bill, I cannot support this amendment. Further discussion on the Cruz amendment? If not, do you want a roll call vote?
Ask for a roll call vote.
Roll call vote.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Schatz?
No.
Mr. Markey? Mr. Peters? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Duckworth? Mr. Tester? Ms. Sinema? Ms. Rosen? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Warnock? Mr. Welch? Mr. Cruz? Mr. Thune? Mr. Wicker? Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran? Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Young? Mr. Budd? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito? Ms. Lummis? Ms. Cantwell? The noes are 15, the yeses are 12.
The amendment fails. Are there further amendments?
Madam Chairman?
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to call up Blackburn 1. And this is an amendment that does deal with safety. You have said safety is the core of this bill, and I think this amendment would strengthen the bill. Now, the current regulatory structure at the FRA makes deploying new technologies very difficult, while the existing waiver program has been grounded. In one recent example of this, the FRA refused to extend a waiver to allow a Class 1 railroad to expand its use of new technology despite a 90% improvement in safety outcomes. This action was so egregious, a court found the agency's actions to be arbitrary, vacated the decision, and sent it back to the agency. In fact, Secretary Buttigieg called on the freight railroads to deploy new inspection technologies like automated track inspection to keep the nation's railroads safe. It shouldn't be this hard to improve safety through new innovative technology. That is why my amendment will allow railroads to submit a safety innovation plan as part of the Railroad Risk Reduction Plan. Once approved, the railroad would be free to pursue these innovative approaches as long as it demonstrates an equivalent or better level of safety. By supporting innovation in new technology rather than relying on outdated standards, we can accomplish our goals by achieving the highest level of rail safety. Again, if we truly want to say the focus is on railroad safety in this country, we ought to consider new technologies that will speed the process of getting us there.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Opposing the amendment, I think I come from one of the most innovative states in the country, and I like innovation. But it doesn't mean that innovation can be a substitute for safety regulation. The regulators still need to do their job. We saw with the MAX 737 what happens when safety regulators don't do that. So I want to be clear about what this amendment does. It allows the railroads to show the Secretary that they have information and data and technology, and that the Secretary, using only some of that data, would then approve the plan for moving the railroad forward. So I am pro-technology and I am pro-innovation, but we still need to have a regulatory process in which the oversight exists with FRA and others to look at the instances of what happened in East Palestine and to make sure that we're implementing safety regulations. So I urge my colleagues to oppose what I think would gut the underlying authority. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Okay. Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Warnock?
No by proxy.
Mr. Welch? Mr. Cruz?
Aye.
Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Wicker? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Moran?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
Aye.
Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Budd? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito? Ms. Lummis? Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 14, the yeses are 13.
Hey, before you click on the next video, if y'all could do me a big favor and hit that like button. The algorithm loves it, and so do I, because it helps promote these videos and get the message out about what our government has been doing. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because every time I put out a video, you want to know about it, right? Thanks again, and have a good one. See you on the next one. Peace.